Well, we are in Hebrews chapter 5 today. And just to give you I'm going to really try to be brief with the recap, but just to give us context, because sometimes as we get further into Hebrews, what we don't want to lose sight of is really the setting, is what's going on with the people that has brought the occasion for this letter, for this. It's really a sermon. It's a word of exhortation, is what he calls it in the end of chapter 13. It's a letter. It's a sermon. It's a spurring on to a people who are weary, to Jewish believers who are under a lot of persecution. They're facing persecution from increasing persecution in the society. And then there's been ongoing from the very beginning for many of them have been kind of a rupture in their own families within, a pressure, a pull from unbelieving Jewish family members to just come back to the norm of what they've always done. At the time this letter is being written, it's the 60s, it's the late 60s of the first century. So the temple's still standing. The sacrificial system is still in full effect. It's in full, not full effect, but in full function. It's functioning, and the high priest is offering up, on Yom Kippur, offering up the sacrifice every year. The blood of bulls and goats and lambs are being offered. And so the temptation in the face of persecution to just go backward, to go back to where you were, to go back to what's comfortable, to go back to what will bring less pressure, what will bring less overt outward pressure, less pressure from within. Let's just fade back. The pressure is intense. And so the writer of Hebrews is wanting to say, look, what's been revealed to us in the Son, in Yeshua, is superior, is better. This is the foundation was laid, but you don't go back to the Mac 2 from 1984 when you've got the MacBook Pro from 2021. You don't go back to that. You keep, because now that what's been revealed to you is superior. It's a superior. There's the Son. It opens up saying God spoke to our fathers in many ways, many times through prophets. God has spoken to us through a Son, and He's the possessor of all things, the heir of all things. I mean, He's not just any Son; He's the one that through whom all things were created. Everything's His, and it was all made through Him. And He holds all things together, right? I mean, it's all His, and He sits at the right hand of the Father, having having cleansed us of our sins. And so the Son is superior. He's superior to angels or whatever messengers. He's superior to prophets. He's superior to Moses. You're going to return to Moses, but Moses was a kind of a servant in the house, and he is the son over the house. And we are that house if indeed we hold firm to the end. So in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1, he says, so don't drift back. What God has spoken to us, we have to hold firmly to what He has spoken. We have to grasp it, take it to ourselves, that which we have heard, so that we don't drift away. And one of the things that's important for us today as we get into Hebrews chapter 5 is now there becomes this real focus on Yeshua functioning as the high priest, on what it means for Him to be the high priest. And up to this point, there have been some different things that have been said on that account, have been written on that account, and that are important for us to remember. In Hebrews 2, verse 11, we're reminded that both He who sanctifies, basically the one who offers the sacrifice, right? He who sanctifies, the consecrating priest, and those being sanctified, those whom he sanctifies, whom he consecrates, are all from one, and so that he is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. And so this idea, the recognition that Yeshua, as the consecrating priest, the priest was they were all of from the seed of Abraham. And so this recognition that Yeshua fully became one of us, we read in verse 17, therefore, of Hebrews chapter 2. Therefore, he had to be in this, the word is sort of this, it must happen. There's an obligation in this regard. The word is ophelen, which we'll see again today. He was obligated. It was a must. It was a necessity that he be made like his brothers in all things, so that he might become a merciful and faithful Kohen Gadol, high priest, in all matters relating to God and everything which is toward God, to make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when put to the test, when he was tested, he is able to help those being tested. Again, this is a word of comfort to those who are in the face of, that are being tested, that are wanting to fade back, to drift away. Don't do that. And that the one who suffered and who is made perfect in suffering is able to help those who are suffering. Therefore, Hebrews 3:1, and sisters, partners in a heavenly calling. So this, we are partakers, partners in a heavenly calling. It says, take notice of Yeshua, we affirm, the high priest of our confession, of that same word, of what God has spoken. He goes on at the end of where we were on Thursday last week, Hebrews 4:14 through 16. I'm skipping way ahead. That said, therefore, since we have a great high priest, a great Kohen Gadol, who has passed through the heavens, Yeshua ben Elohim, Yeshua, Son of God, the Son through whom God has spoken to us, let us hold firmly to our confessed allegiance. It says, let us powerfully, strongly grasp, hold on to the homologia, the same word, that confession, that same word that he is our high priest. Verse 15, for we do not have a Kohen Gadol who is unable, who doesn't have the capacity to sympathize with our weaknesses or with our strengthlessness, astheneas, with our lack of strength. He understands. His sympathy is with suffering. He has been there. We don't have a high priest who is not able to sympathize with our strengthlessness, with our weaknesses, but one who was tempted in all the same ways, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near to the throne of grace with boldness, with confidence, the language is the whole utterance, so that we may receive mercy and find grace for help in time of need, or in just the right time, in a timely fashion, in the moment we need help, that we would find exactly the favor, the grace that we need. So, having really focused now at the end of chapter 4 on Yeshua as the great high priest, that he is priest, the writer of Hebrews now zooms in on that for a moment, and he's going to come back to it with even greater clarity. So he stays on this point of Yeshua as high priest, and on what that is all about. And the first thing that he focuses on is really some principles about relating to the high priesthood that we would see in the Tanakh, in the Torah. And so, here's the deal. Whatever your perception is of the high priest, at the very beginning in chapter 5, whatever one's perception of the high priest is, the high priest, he's untouchable. Look at the high priest. There's this distance that you feel. Can you imagine, like, the high priest in our day, even in our religious circles, there's a sense of there's an appropriate sense of respect for the place where God has put someone, where God has appointed them. And yet we have to understand too that they are just people, that they are just men. And so sometimes people can put people in high places of leadership on such a pedestal that they fail to see that they too are like us. And so the point was that the high priest, no matter what your perception is, that has his own weaknesses. He is not sinless. He is subject to weakness. And so that the high priest has to sacrifice for his own sins. And so we read here in verse 1 of chapter 5. For every high priest, every Kohen Gadol, who is taken from among men, is appointed to act on behalf of the people in matters relating to God, so that he may offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. Right. So every high priest that from men is taken on behalf of men, having been appointed to the things of God, in order that he may offer gifts and sacrifices for the sake of sins. Right. So that's his job. He's got to offer sacrifices for the sake of sins. So there are a couple of things. There are four main things that we're going to look at that are prerequisites to be the high priest. And number one, he originates from among the people. He's taken from among the people. And so for someone to qualify as a high priest, he obviously has to be human. He has to be from among them. If he's going to stand on behalf of his brothers, to say, I stand here as a representative before God for my brothers, he has to be taken from among the people. The second thing was his role was to represent the people in matters related to God, particularly through gifts and sacrifices, right? He was to offer the blood sacrifices. He was to offer these gifts before the Lord. And the high priest in particular was the only one who could enter into the most holy place on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur. And again, you'll remember that many of the believers that are being addressed here were likely that a number of them would have been had served in the priesthood. We read in Acts chapter, the end of Acts chapter 6, I believe verse 53, that even many priests had come to faith. And so they understood these aspects about the priesthood. Verse 2, continuing to talk about the high priest of the line of Aaron. It says, the high priest is able to empathize with the ignorant and deluded, since he himself also is subject to weakness, right? So the opening word here, it's in Greek, is metrio pathen. So kind of, he's able, pathen is from pasko, meaning to suffer, and metrio is kind of like having to do with moderately. So it has to do with he is able to suffer moderately, or to deal gently with. He's able to deal, he has, and it uses the word for able, dunamis, his like dynamite. Like he has the power, the capacity, the ability to deal. The reason that the high priest is to have the capacity to deal moderately with people in their, and the language used here is in their ignorance, in their not knowing, the ones not knowing, is the first word. And then the second word is planomenois, which is the ones who have wandered, the errant ones, the ones who have erred or wandered. He is able to deal gently, he has the capacity to deal gently with them because of his own. He is subject to weakness. We'll look at that in just a second. So he has the capacity, he has the power to be gentle with those who are either ignorant or who wander off the path. So this idea of the ignorant and the errant ones, those straying through not knowing or wandering off the path. There's a difference, and this will get spelled out later in the book of Hebrews. But there's a difference between that and defiance against God. There's a contrast. It's actually evident in the Torah. If you look back in Numbers 15, verses 29 to 31, it says, whenever a native born of the children of Israel or an outsider living among them, one Torah, one instruction, one law applies to you for the one sinning unintentionally, for the one sinning bishgaga, which is in error, who's sinning inadvertently. verse 30, but the person who sins defiantly, literally it's beyad ramah, with hand exalted, with a hand of pride, with a hand lifted up. The one who sins not accidentally, but coming at you, hand raised high, defiantly, whether native or outsider, reviles Adonai, and that person is to be cut off from his people because he has despised bazah, he has thought lightly of, been in contempt of the word of Adonai and has broken his mitzvot. That person will be cut off, his guilt will remain on him. So the focus here is these who are in their ignorance, wandering, who are in ignorance, those who are wandering from the path. Look, the high priest has the capacity because he himself, and the language here is, there's a word in the word in Hebrew. In Greek, it's a two-part word. It's peri ketai. So peri is a preposition concerning, about, surrounding. Okay, that kind of idea. And the word ketai is from kemai, meaning to recline or lay down. And so it actually says, because he is surrounded and kind of has been laid down in and surrounded in weakness, in strengthlessness. So the high priest has the ability, the capacity to understand and to deal gently with those who are ignorant and those who are wandering, because he himself has been laid down and surrounded in strengthlessness, in weakness. And so again, we see it's the same kind of language that we saw back in verse 15, Hebrews 4:15. We do not have a Kohen Gadol, speaking of Yeshua, who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, with our strengthlessness, same word, but one who has been tempted in all the same ways, yet without sin, but without sin. And so the fact is, the high priest was tempted in every way, but he was not sinless, he was not faultless, and that's why verse 3 says, for this reason, the high priest has to make offerings for sins, just as for the people, so also for himself, right? And literally, and because of this, he's obligated. He must, just as for the people, so also concerning himself, to bring an offering in regard to sins. What he has to do for the people, he's got to do for himself. The high priest that you guys are wanting to return to that. He has to make the same sacrifice for his own sins. Verse 4, and no one takes this honor for himself, but only when he is called by God, as Aaron was. Right? And so I'm going to give you the literal translation. Someone does not take the honor to himself, but rather take the honors from being called by God. And there's an emphatic kind of just as Aaron was. The high priest doesn't get to appoint himself, but he's the one who gives. But God is the one who gives that appointment. God is the one who appoints him. It is only conferred by divine authority. He doesn't get to, in the language, is to grasp that honor, to take being high priest. People tried to do it. You know, you look back during the time of the Maccabees and what was going on between these two brothers in the Maccabean revolt between Joshua and Jason. He doesn't get to take being high priest. God initiated the role of high priest, and any high priest afterward must be called by God to be considered authoritative and authentic as a representative for the people before God. So, the writer of Hebrews is making the point that the superior messenger of the superior covenant, he's a superior apostle, sent one, superior to Moses. Yeshua is the superior high priest. He's better. Why are you going to go back? He's better. Why are you going to go backward? Why are you going to drift back? Don't turn away. Don't drift away. So again, the four things about the high priest. He's got to originate from among the people. His role is to represent people in matters related to God, particularly through offering gifts and sacrifices. Third, the high priest's weakness enables him to deal gently with the people. And fourth, the high priest doesn't get to appoint himself. God's the one who gives that appointment. And so now the writer in not necessarily in the same order, points how Yeshua is the great high priest, that he actually fulfills all of that, but in a greater way. Two of these things he's already addressed previously, right? Back in chapter 2, pointing out that he is from the seed of Abraham, that he became like us in every way. He is one of us, among us. He was not ashamed to call us brothers and sisters, right? And then at the end of chapter 4, he's tempted in every way, yet without sin. So he doesn't have to offer a sacrifice on behalf of his own sin because he hasn't sinned. But here the point was that the high priest doesn't appoint himself. God's the one who gives that appointment. And he says in verse 5, so also Messiah did not glorify himself to be made Kohen Gadol, to be high priest, but rather it was God who said to him, you are my son. Today I have become your father. So that's the first part. You are my son. Today I myself have begotten you. He points back to Psalm 2:7. I will declare the decree of Adonai. He said to me, Bina ata, my son are you. You are my son. This day I have begotten you. I have brought you forth. Today I have become your father. And then in verse 6 here, he connects these two passages. It says, and he says in a different passage, you are a Kohen forever. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So he points back to Psalm 110 here. Now, Melchizedek, Melech, is a two-part word. His name is Melech Tzedek, which is king of righteousness, or my king of righteousness, or king of my righteousness. Melech Tzedek, and he was a king of Jerusalem and a priest of God. He was a priest of God Most High. We read in Genesis 14:18. It says, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, Jerusalem's Salem, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of El Elyon, Kohen El Elyon, priest to God Most High. So, back in Genesis 14, you get this sudden, out of nowhere, no real introduction, sudden appearance and disappearance of Melchizedek. There's a mystery surrounding him. And in Genesis 14, we're told that Melchizedek's assistance to Abraham, we're told of his assistance to Abraham and of his blessing upon Abraham. He continues in verse 19, it says of Melchizedek, he blessed him and said, blessed be Avram by El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be El Elyon, who gave over your enemies into your hand. And then Avram gave him a tenth of everything. So Abraham, and at this point his name still was Avram, he presented Melchizedek with a tithe, with a tenth of what he had gained through this recent victory in battle when he had gone to rescue Lot. So in doing that, in giving the tenth, the tithe to Melchizedek, he recognized Melchizedek as, first of all, a fellow worshiper of the same God, of the one true God, as well as a priest who, for lack of a better phrase, was someone who ranked higher than him spiritually. And regarding Melchizedek, that's it. That's all we get until David speaks of him in Psalm 110. In Psalm 110, Melchizedek is depicted as a messianic figure. We read some of this yesterday, but in verse 1, a Psalm of David, Adonai declares, and it's an utterance of the Lord. This is a prophetic word, an utterance spoken. Thus says the Lord, to my master, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. So David says, Adonai uttered to my master, sit at my right hand. Verse 2, Adonai will extend your mighty rod from Zion, rule in the midst of your enemies. So in keeping with God's promise to David, God's covenant to David, that his descendants will never depart from the throne, he says, here's what's going to happen. That the Lord, that your a scepter of your might will be sent out from Zion. Adonai will send out a scepter of your might from Zion, rule in the innermost being of your enemies. So David here is calling his own descendant, because the one who is the scepter, who going forth from him, calling his own descendant, my Lord. If that were just any descendant, that'd be strange, right? To speak of your grandchildren that would come from you, your great-great-great-grandchildren, as my Lord, my Master, the one who will carry forth this scepter, it would have been strange. But this descendant is different. This ruler, this Adon, this Lord in the future will not just be a king. It says in verse 4 of Psalm 110, so that this one of the line of David is of the line of Judah, right? He's not of the Levitic lineage. He's of the line of Judah. And his scepter, his descendant, it is said of him in verse 4 of Psalm 110, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, will not relent. You are a priest forever. How is it that one of the line of David is a priest forever when David is of the line of Judah? This is a different priesthood. This is a priesthood that precedes the Aaronic priesthood. This is a priesthood that precedes the Levitical priesthood. He says, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, I'm already digging into this, but at this point, the writer of Hebrews doesn't spend a lot of time here. He just touches on this very briefly, and then he comes back to it a little bit later with more specificity. So you've got here, he mentioned only in Genesis 14:18, and then 1,000 years later, Psalm 110:4. You know, one of the things that you see here, this question of God has sworn by himself. God has sworn. Like whenever God speaks, whatever God speaks is true. So why is it that the Lord at this point says, where it says, Adonai has sworn and will not relent, will not change his mind? Speaking of the descendant of David, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Whenever you see where it says that the Lord has sworn, the Lord is drawing our attention to something that he's doing. When you look at all of history, I imagine putting a red push pin everywhere it says the Lord has sworn by himself, where the Lord makes an oath, that he's pointing to his grander purposes. He's saying, I want you to pay attention to this. This is something that really needs to stand out, so mark this. So 1,000 years before David wrote this, you have this situation in Genesis 14 with Melchizedek and Abraham. And then you don't hear of him again. And then 1,000 years later, out of nowhere, the Lord gives this oath to an utterance to Adoni, my Lord, to my master, David says. And he says that your scepter will extend and you will be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So that Yeshua, the line of David, is of a different order. He's of a superior order, one which precedes Abraham. And again, the writer of Hebrews will make this point later. In fact, when we get to the end today, he goes, look, there's a lot I have to say about this. But right at the moment, you're spiritually not in the place. I need to deal with some other things, and he's going to kind of bring some correction. So of these high priest prerequisites, the first one Yeshua fulfills is he was appointed by God. But his priesthood is forever. Later he's going to make the point that his priesthood is without beginning, like Melchizedek is without beginning and without end. And so he's appointed by God. Okay, so back to looking verses 5. So in this way, Messiah did not glorify himself to become priest, but rather it was the one saying to him, "You are my son. Today I myself have begotten you." Just like also in another place he says, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." So Messiah, the Son, God has spoken to us through a Son, a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, who, verse 7, in the days of his life on earth, you see, I don't know if you're looking at your TLV, but Yeshua, the name Yeshua is inserted here because it just says, it's speaking about Messiah from verse 5, and it doesn't actually insert his name here. It says, who in the days of his life on earth offered up both prayers and pleas with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Okay, so speaking of Messiah, who in the days of his flesh offered both prayers and supplication with loud wailing and tears to the one who has the power to save, deliver, rescue him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence, or his piety, his devotion. So when it opens up, it says in the days of his flesh, in his humanity, that he was among us. And in his humanity, he understands. He himself facing death. Now remember, this is being written to believers who are afraid, who are suffering, who are weary, who are tired. And one of the ways to avoid suffering and death is to possibly just drift back to where you were. But when you look at Yeshua, he himself was in the days of his flesh, he offered up prayers, he offered up pleas for favor, supplication, right? And it says with a strong crying, with a powerful crying, with loud wailing, as it were, and with like drops and with tears. It's pointing, obviously, it's pointing to Luke 22. It's pointing to Yeshua in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Luke 22:41, and he pulled back about a stone's throw from them, got on his knees and began to pray, saying, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Now an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And in his anguish he was praying fervently, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling down on the ground. I want you to notice something here, because in this passage in Hebrews, it points to this with loud wailing and with tears, and it uses the word tears because his tears were as his sweat was as drops of blood, but it has that language for like big drops. And he was praying to the one who has the power to deliver him from death. And it says, and he was heard. But wait a second. It says he was heard because of his reverence or his piety. But there are some scholars, there are some commentators that say, well, what he's talking about in Hebrews chapter 5 isn't pointing to Gethsemane, because they suggest he wasn't heard because he still died on the cross, because he still didn't get to escape this cup. But he was heard. He prayed, "Father, if it's your will, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done." And the Lord answered him by strengthening him for what was in front of him. The Lord heard and answered and didn't let the cup pass. It was because his desire was not that the cup pass. There was a suffering in front of him that had to be accomplished. It had to happen. And so he was facing it, and he was praying loudly, and he was with great tears, and God heard his prayers, but it didn't necessarily equate to what you would have envisioned as the kind of deliverance that he would have wanted as an answer to the prayer. And yet we see God did hear. God hears. He just doesn't always answer us in the way that we want. But he strengthened us. He strengthened him. He sent an angel and he strengthened him. And he continued to pray, and he was sweating as though it were drops of blood. So what we see even here is this, in his praying, is this point of identification that he prayed, and he prays on, we understand that he prays on our behalf. So he's from the people. His role is to represent people in the people in matters related to God. The high priest is able to deal gently with those who are straying or wandering. He didn't get to appoint himself, and so now in verse 8 it turns to his sacrifice. I'm almost done. It says, though he was a son, he learned, and it uses a language that would almost be like he was discipled. Though he was a son. And honestly, the word for though is not the usual word for though. It's a combination word, kiper, which is the word ki, which is and per, which is peri, concerning, about, around. So concerning him as son, and concerning him as son. Concerning him as a son, his existence as son, he learned, he was discipled in obedience, in hearing, in Shema, as it were, in hearing and doing from that which he suffered. So though he is son, even as a son, he partook in the discipline. He partook in having to obey, having to submit to what he heard, to submit to what he had to do through suffering. It's not what I want, but your will be done. If it's possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done. And he was discipled, he learned through suffering. And so this one is among us, and he himself suffered. And verse 9, and once made perfect, and being made perfect, being made complete, with there being the completion, the conclusion, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. So it says he submitted to hearing, right? He was discipled through suffering in obedience, in hearing, and it uses now all of us. He is the source of eternal salvation for all who will hear and do, who will shema, who will listen to him. So saying that Messiah's obedience was made complete, made perfect, it doesn't mean it was somehow incomplete. It just, the word teleos has to do with it being brought to its fulfillment in its goal, having reached its goal. So he learned it, he walked it, he knows it, he laid down his own rights, his own desires of his humanity, and submitted to the will of the Father. For him to have learned obedience means that the Son arrived at this new stage of experience. You know, he passed through the school of suffering and conquered it. His suffering was made complete. It was made final. And in that, he is making us complete. He is the one who brings us to completion, to fulfillment, to the goal. And so in John 19:30, he says, it is finished. Tetelestai, it is complete. The goal has been reached. It's perfected. Same thing. It's perfect. It's complete. I've completed what I came to do. Right? So verse 9, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God, high priest, Kohen Gadol, according to the order of Melchizedek, right? So he returns. There's this reiteration of God's formal calling of Yeshua as the great high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So now, having mentioned this Melchizedek again, right? He has to stop. He says in verse 11, which I have it on there. We're stopping here today, but he says, about this subject, there's much for us to say. And it's hard to explain since you've become sluggish in hearing. And so he has to pause now before he can continue to dig in to Melchizedek. He has to hit the pause button and say, I need to deal with you guys. And he brings a word of correction. He brings now, in what we'll look at going at the back end of chapter 5 into chapter 6, is a word of correction. And it intensifies in chapter 6 and then he's able to come back to talk about Melchizedek and really open up what has been there and what everyone has missed all along. He's like, I want to show you this stuff. You should be getting this by now, but you don't. You become sluggish in your hearing. You're fading backward. Get your eyes, wanting to go back to an old high priest. But you need to focus on the high priest of the order of Melchizedek, and we'll get there. So anyway, so that's where we'll pause for today. See you tomorrow. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom, shalom. Have a beautiful day.